I am going to be chairing this panel, but I'm also filling in and replacing one of the speakers that unfortunately was unable to come. So I am going to be, which made some changes to this panel. Basically, I inserted myself into as one of the speakers. I'm going to be first, and then we will have Professor Annie Green, Professor Yuval Ivri, and Professor Lital Levy. I urge you to refer to the biographies in your booklets because we want to save time in not reading what they're doing, so you get it there. So it will maximize the time for talking. I will be also chairing this panel. This is a talk that I put together very quickly last night. I apologize for its style and for the amusement with the title. So this topic is about modernities. I am going to trying to talk about actually Eastern modernities coming from East Asian modernities coming to Western Asia. I'm going to focus on mostly what's going on in China, but a little bit also what's going on in India. I actually reduced the Indian part, given that there is another paper on India anyway. So we are reading in a book, in a very important, very long report, 900 pages report, summarizing the activities, the railway activities in China, put by a British bureaucrat. We are reading a letter that he includes there that was sent in March 21st, 1864, from the company of David Sassoon and Sons, and it says as follows. Dear Sir, we have been favored with your esteemed communication of the 29th ultimo respecting the introduction of railways into China, and after having given it our careful consideration, it affords us much pleasure to state that it is our conviction that the completion of the various lines enumerated in your letter will confer a great benefit on the country, both socially and commercially. As an experimental line, we think that connecting Shanghai with Suzhou would be most suitable, as likely to pay best. Okay? This is a letter that was written by Iraqi Jews in Hong Kong, based in Hong Kong, with a branch in Shanghai, to the management of the railway project in China in the 1860s. Now let me try to make it to make a big deal out of this letter. Okay? It's very clear from this letter that we are talking about, these people understand themselves to be a part of a much bigger project. In fact, this project has a global significance, certainly national significance for China. The railroads in China are built by the British in the eastern part and by the French in the southwestern part. The railroads are changing the Chinese geography because you're now able to move commodities in different ways. The railroads create new cities, or they give significance no significance to new locations and so on, simply because you can move people and you can move commodities, you can move the industry and so on. In fact, the railroad projects, the Western Railroads project in China was part of the way in which colonialism appeared in China. China was never fully colonized, but it was colonized through the railroads. What is significant about that is that the people who are now part of this project themselves, are not British, they're not European, they don't come from the earlier projects of, building railroads in Europe. These are Iraqi Jews that migrated before as part of a completely different story, but they are now very, very quickly integrated into that. You can see from the letter, with great benefit to the country. This is always what colonized do. They always do it for the great benefit of the country. Yes, there's nothing to do for them. Yes, so they speak the same. They have the same values of the colonized. Great benefit for the countries, both socially and commercially, etc., etc., etc. Okay, and they are talking about a very small line, Shanghai and Suzhou. Suzhou is a very, very important city, important for gardens. Shanghai actually was a fisherman village until 1849. The British got it, as part of their reparations for their victory in the First Opium War. No one really wanted to go there until the Sassoons decided that the Sassoons got the permission to go to do that. This is the entire railway project. that is going on, that is built. It is actually creating the Chinese hinterland, which is here. Because if you're not covered by the railroads, you're now becoming remote. Yes, this has a lot of significance for Chinese politics later. And we're talking about Shanghai is right here, and we're talking about the line to Suzhou is right here. It's very, very small. It's minuscule if you think about China, but it is incredibly significant because it is connecting the emerging port of China, which is being built by Iraqi Jews at the time, you know, with a very major city in the Yangtze Delta that is famous for its Silk Road production, so traditional Silk Road production in that period. So in fact, Suzhou is the main city, and it needs to be connected to Shanghai, who is not a very, very important city, but is becoming a very important point. And you know, today is the most significant city in Asia. Okay. Until 1849, there were a bunch of fishermen in Shanghai. Ningbo in China was the main one. Yeah, I don't know why I put this one. Okay. Now, how do these people actually get to China, or to India, and to China, and to elsewhere? You know, I discussed it a little bit in the historical overview that I was talking about, because I'm trying to emphasize the Asian dimension of Iraqi Jewish history. Okay, so this is just a map of, you know, the Indian Ocean trade routes and traders in Asia, and particularly in the sea, in the 19th century. As someone who's been dedicating a lot of time to study actually the Muslim trade networks in the earlier period between China and the Middle East, from the 9th century to the 16th century, I can assure you that that's pretty much very similar to what was before. Yes, in the 14th century, you see something very similar to that emerges in the Mongol period. But there are two exceptions. The identity of the people now is a little different than the earlier ones. I mean, you have a lot of Brits, a lot of Dutch, some Portuguese, etc. But you now also have a lot of Baghdadi Jews who are coming from different places in Iraq, and Baghdad and Basra, but all of them are becoming known as Baghdadis. Now that's amazing. I should tell my wife there's someone in the crowd doesn't hear me with a microphone. Okay. She complains I'm too loud. Okay, so one of the things that you see here is that, you know, the key area is, of course, the Gulf. You know, Iraq has access to the Gulf through Shatt al-Arab and al-Basra. I mean, and through these areas. If you reconstruct, and I try to reconstruct the escape route of the Sassoons, so they come to Muscat, you know, and you have a diary of a British officer in Muscat who is describing how they arrive in Muscat, and from there, it's all very, very close. We think about India as something very remote, but actually it's like all in the same neighborhood. Okay, once you get to here, you know, and this is the British dimension, you want to get to Bengal, because Bengal was the first English colony. Yes, even though it is actually much more to the west there. And from there, you know, you get to, you cross the Malacca Straits, and you are in the Chinese part of the Indian Ocean. There are a lot of adventurers, a lot of people who are taking advantage of this emerging new and old trade routes and routes of communication, and Iraqi Jews are part of that. Okay, but the most interesting commodity that is being trafficked at the time is, of course, opium. And the opium is a very, very interesting story. We can't go much into it, although I would love to. The main point that we should know is that opium was used in China for medicinal purposes for a very, very long time. Yes, but because the balance of trade in the 18th century was completely towards China, you know, China was exporting everything to Europe: tea, porcelain, furniture, gardens, everything. Yes, the British or any other Europeans were not selling to China nothing. It's pretty much like today. Yes. Lord Macartney was sent by the court to China, to the Qianlong Emperor in 1782. You know, he met him. He said, well, you know, maybe you should buy something for us as well, you know, because the balance of trade is completely in your favor. Qianlong Emperor said, you know, there's nothing we need from you. He was actually right. Yes. Lord McCartney goes back home and he says, we need to do something else. And then someone comes with a brilliant idea. Why don't we convert the Bengali agricultural economy, yes, to opium and start selling it to the Chinese, yes? So the British begin to traffic opium from Bengal to Canton, yes? And they need people to do that. You know, inside China, these are Chinese merchants that are buying the opium from the British merchants at the coast, you know, and moving it forward, okay? But you need a lot of other people, and the Sassoons who are arriving in the beginning of the 19th century, the 1820s and 30s, they're arriving that they're part of that movement. Yes, so there's a growing market of opium in China. At that period, and since they're already based in India, you know, it is easy for them to move. Now, I don't know if you know that, but this is such a big deal that when Karl Marx hears about all of that, and he writes about all of that, he also hears that, you know, Protestant missionaries are smuggling Bibles inside the opium chests that are coming, that the British are pushing into. And in an article to the New York Post, he was writing articles to the New York Post at the time, he writes, you know, this is the proof that religion is opium for the masses. So in other words, that famous sentence is not a metaphor. He was literally meant, you know, that Bibles, you know, used in that. But not everything is about, of course, is about opium. A little bit about David Sassoon, very famous. Pay attention to the way he's dressed, because we're going to see now, we're talking about modernity. Let's see how his children are going to get dressed and his grandchildren are going to get dressed. Okay, so Key is involved in fact, there's some involvement, you know, with modernization projects that are kind of beginning under Daoud Pasha, you know, in Iraq, the Georgian Mamluk governor, you know, and he's his treasurer and so on. You know, I would love to talk a little bit about what I think what happened in Baghdad, why he needed to, quote unquote, escape, but maybe not today. Yes, we had enough controversies already. The point is that, you know, he is established himself in India, and one of the things that is very interesting, that shortly after his arrival, they already have licenses and they already begin with very serious economic activity. And that begs the question, why? Yes? Like, there's no one smart enough in India to develop India, that you need Iraqi Jews to do that. You know, what's the story with the British? They are completely devoid of very skilled people from Manchester, that they need to get all of these people from Baghdad to do the work for them. Okay, that's a very interesting question. In other words, it's so quickly, you know, less than 3 decades after these people arrive in India, they're already based in Hong Kong and they are managing the railway station, the building of the railroads in China. How quickly and why does it happen? Okay, that's the central question that I will try to raise and to answer. Okay, so the beginning was, of course, opium, but also railroads and cotton and so on. These are his children. Okay. Pay attention to the youngest one is already dressed a little bit more in a Western code. Okay, I'm moving fast to 1908. In 1908, already like the British colony in Hong Kong is very established. You know, it's been almost 60 years that they are there, and now they begin to celebrate themselves. So one of the descriptions of the Sassoon family in this book that celebrates the colonial community in Hong Kong talks about them in a very interesting way. And I'm pointing out here to the connections between the Baghdadis and empire, yes? And it says, you know, there are certain businesses in Hong Kong whose rise to prosperity and importance has synchronized with the progress and development of the colony itself. Yes, pay attention here to the fact that the interest of the empire and the interest of these businesses converge. Yes, it wasn't supposed to be. Yes, no Iraqi Jew was sitting here in Whitehall and planning how to design the empire. These are hangers-on who basically doing it, but you know, the British Empire actually understands that this is good for the empire, okay? Among the historic firms having their roots right down to the foundation of the colony, that of the Mrs. E.D. Sassoon and his company must certainly be included. So these are pillars of the colonial project in in Hong Kong at least, yes? And then the author, who's a nice British Gentile who had nothing had to do with Jewish history, writes a brief narrative of the family, and if you pay attention to the language, I'm not going to read all of it, if you pay attention to the language, you can see who's been feeding him with all of the information. Yes, it's the Sassoons themselves, okay? And they tell him, you know, they came and the founder of this house, he was born in Baghdad and settled in Bombay in 1832, you know. And of course, the father, you know, enjoyed the pride title of Nasi, Prince of Captivity, and in virtue of that, head of the Jewish community in Mesopotamia. In other words, if you didn't know, let me tell you now, the Sassoons, yes, according to this British clerk, basically, you know, their history is go all the way back to Jerusalem, to the Davidic house. Then they were, you know, the head of the community and the descendants of King David in Mesopotamia. And they were been just waiting for 2,500 years just to get to Hong Kong and build railroads in China. That was the story. That's the narrative that's the narrative that is being built. What is interesting here is the convergence, again, the convergence between empire interests, imperial interests, and business interests of these people, but at the same time, you know, the deep consciousness of themselves that they really need to build a new narrative about their family and about you know their dynasty. Yes, I mean, of course, you know, the office of the Nasi. We have many contenders over histories. You should read Avraham ben Yaakov's stories. I'm not sure the Sassoons were, in fact, you know, part of Prince of the Captivity from early on. But in Hong Kong, it really worked. Now, okay, this is from the same book. And you can see here the way the portraiture works and, you know, the confidence and so on. Also, we are talking about steam and coal production reaches their very important part of 19th century economy. And you have David Sassoon here and his children and their houses that they are built. They are very confident, very British businessmen. Okay, a few decades later, you know, things get even worse. Pay attention to the mustaches, you know, they grow. Yeah. This is Jacob Sassoon, and now we are now in Shanghai. Okay, and 1,800 buildings only for the Kaduris in Shanghai, and you know a lot more. You know, the city is developing very rapidly, and people are creating massive fortunes. Yes, I would like to point out that Shanghai is not a Chinese city. It becomes a Chinese city only after the Taiping Rebellion in the 1860s, where many Chinese elites from the Yangtze Delta are fleeing the Taiping Rebellion and they become part of the city. Actually, in the first 2 decades, most of the people there were actually foreigners. Okay, now, a very important point before I transition to something related but completely different in terms of modernity, a very important point is like we need to ask ourselves, okay, well, we all know that, you know, Iraqi Jews are so, you know, great and smart and, you know, they do everything in medicine and in accounting and all of that stuff. Yes, but why are the British so impressed about it? How come, you know, in 1832, someone shows up in Bombay and he says, well, I want to become part of your empire. And the British says, well, of course, here, take all the licenses and do whatever you want. What was the frame of mind of the British officers of the empire operating in Asia with regards to Jews in general, but also in particular also to Iraqi Jews? That's the question. Now, in order to understand that, we need to go back to the origins of capitalism, particularly in England, but not only in England, but also in Germany and in France, in the early modern period, in the 17th and 18th century. And one of the things that you see there is a slight change, a slight positive change, you know, from the original anti-Semitic views of Jews towards, that actually speaks about Jews much more positively. And this is with the rise of commercialism, mercantilism, and trade. So I'm going to quote you, I mean, Voltaire writes about it a lot, but I'm going to quote you one of the earliest one by a man by the name Josiah Child, who wrote a very important book called A New Discourse on Trade, a very important document in the history of capitalism. And he talks about the Jews. Now, when I say that the meaning here is positive, it's not because, you know, that they started loving Jews, but they started to understand the utility of Jews for trade, because this is now an agricultural society that is transforming itself into commercial and industrial one. And I'm not going to read all of it. I hope that you managed to read a little bit here, but basically he says Jews are very skilled merchants. Now, he speaks about European Jews, okay? But when I was here last year, let me see if I included that. I hope I included that. I didn't include that image. I will talk about it for one brief moment, okay? This image of Jews being good with trade, yes, is very, very important, first of all, because of the medieval connections, which, by the way, needs to be modified, you know, being bankers in Europe, et cetera, et cetera. But the other thing that is going on here is also biblical stereotypes, and, you know, ancient stereotypes of Jews that are basically that they are good with money. And when I was here last year, I was discussing, you know, the work, a 900-page book, you know, on the geography of Asia that was written by James Rennell, who was the chief geographer in Bengal. And he has a chapter where he discusses the idea of Jews in exile, and he basically comes to the conclusion that Jews are good for the economy, particularly when it comes to managing finances. He specifically zooms on that, which is what they need. They need people to manage their finances in this emerging economy in Asia, they being the British. And one of the interesting things, he does not rely on sociological material, he doesn't rely on evidence, he relies on ancient books. So one of the important books, one of the books that he quotes extensively is a book called the Book of Tobit, or Sefer Tuvia. Now, the Book of Tobit was written in Jerusalem after the destruction of the temple in around the year 70, okay? The narrative of the book is very interesting. The author of the book was sitting in Jerusalem, but he created a story about a man named Tuvia who lives in Nineveh. Pay attention, that's Mosul, yes? And he is, actually, he's living there. It's like the book is pretending to be like 800 years before he was, and he happens to be working for, exiled by the Assyrians, you know, even before the Babylonians, and he lives in Nineveh, and what does he do? He works as an accountant for the Assyrian emperor. This is all made up story. Now, the arc of the story is, of course, maintaining Jewish identity in exile, but the framework of the story is that Tuvia has a debt in Khorasan, in the Medes, the deep in Asian territory, and he sends his son to collect the debt, yes? And his son, so the whole book is basically his letters and his admonishments to his son, you know, how you're going to go and collect the debt. And the son travels all over Asia, from Nineveh all the way to Afghanistan, yes, and he managed to collect the debt and to come back, yes. So James Rennell, yes, reads the book and he says, you see, this book is proof. It's proof that, you know, these people are very good, you know, they can manage, you know, finances across long distances, yes. And then he ends the book. Rennell writes in 1798. In other words, 40 years before. 40 years, okay. 40 years before David Sassoon even arrives, yes. But he says, wouldn't be a great idea if we bring some Jews like this guy from Nineveh to come here and manage our finances there, okay? This is an indication to the frame of mind of the British at the time. So so I'm not saying that David Sassoon, you know, was like they invited him to come. But when he showed up, for whatever reason, they were already in the frame of mind that these people could be of great utility for the empire. Very, very quickly, I'm going to zoom in on one person who's very dear to all of us, Saleh or Salas Hardoon, who arrives as a young boy to work for the Kaduris in Shanghai and makes his own fortune. At some point, he was the richest man in Asia, yes. He married a half-Russian, half-Chinese woman by the name of Lisa. And let me tell you, look at her portrait. If you go to Central Casting, you say, send me a half-Chinese, half-Russian woman married to an Iraqi Jew, she would look like this. He's a real builder of Shanghai. You know, he came as a poor orphan boy. You know, and he did all of that. You know, very nice family. He's actually well known in China. He was well known negatively, yes, but later on, you know, he was pretty much rehabilitated, and you know, is very well known now in the city of Shanghai. And this is here, you know, with the president of China, and then with Sun Yat-sen, and with others, you know. One of the reasons that I really like him, because he was also involved with the project of translating the Quran into Chinese. Yes, for Chinese Muslims. That has huge significance for people who work on Chinese Islam like myself, you know, because of the beginning of the modernization of Chinese Islam is actually associated, among other things, with this man who hired and paid for a Muslim imam in Shanghai to translate the Quran into Chinese, which never before happened. You know, it's like something. So, one of the things that he does, he was very tuned to Chinese culture, and I'm going to end with that. You know, he was modern and non-modern at the same time. This is a portrait of the family. Yes, look at the colors and so on. Look at the various details. They're drinking tea. Look at the sounds. There's nothing better. If you want to be really British, you have to be British in China. Okay? And this is how they are, and this is what they do. But the interesting thing is that, in fact, the painter, he uses a style, you know, that actually is not modern, but goes back to the deep Manchu period. And this is a portrait of a Jesuit painter, Giuseppe Castiglione, who had a whole portrait of, you know, the Emperor Yongzheng, you know, and it's very, very similar to that style that is adopted here, you know, kind of a peaceful, natural scene with the emperor just enjoying nature and so on. So, you know, Salah Khardoun is actually, he paid for the painter to do that, you know, and clearly this was in dialogue with that part as well. This is, you know, Nanjing Road in China today, Nanjing-Lu, you know, very, very near to one of the parks that is called today People's Park, but used to be Salah Khardoun's park in developing in the city. And thank you very much, and this is what I have to say about modernity.